Hello and welcome. Biblical Theology Today here. I want to continue our series on the passage in Genesis 6:2 about the sons of God and the daughters of Ha-Adam to look and see, is this really what many modern people say angels producing offspring with human women, or is this something else? And I've been arguing in this series that it's the marriage of people on earth claiming to be ones following the Lord, and yet they intermarry with pagan women. And when we've looked through this material, did a video on how the idiom to take for themselves wives from, that's all about intermarriage, and you can see how many times that's used in the text. Go and look at that video. We've talked about how the sons of God, many people will say, well, the phrase B'nai Ha-Elohim is never applied to anything but angels, and I think that's how it's said. That's true if the reading of Deuteronomy 32:8 is sons of Israel, and I think that's where it is. So there's B19A printed text of BHS, but the problem, and we saw this in a previous video, is that the oldest copy of Deuteronomy 6:8, 4Q37, the 37th manuscript from Cave 4 at Qumran, we saw that text, which this is the page from Deuteronomy, that text actually reads the sons of Elohim, and here's the transcription of it. And in fact, the Quinta, which is still an eclectic text, printing B19A, but with the extended text critical notes, notice they are preferring the reading, the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. And if that's true, then people who claim that, B'nai Ha-Elohim is only used ever of angels, it's just not true. I mean, if sons of God is there, clearly they're applying this to Israel, not angels. All the passages that we saw when we did that video. But what I want to look at today is the passages in Job. So many people will say, well, Job clearly is taking the phrase B'nai Ha-Elohim and it's angels. And of course, that absolutely is the reading that the Septuagint has there. So the Septuagint is reading it as angels. But it's interesting, this phrase, to stand upon the Lord, so the Hithpael of Yatsab, plus this preposition all, is that only used of angels, or is it ever used of anyone else? And I did a search a long time ago in BibleWorks. It's very easy to do in BibleWorks, where I did Yatsab and then all, and asked to do a proximity search everywhere those two words appear close to each other. I can't run BibleWorks anymore on my computer. I got a new Macintosh, and BibleWorks, at least I've had a difficult time getting it to run on a Mac, but Accordance has some of the same features, and so I did that same proximity search, and here we have, and clearly this is the priest and Levites are presenting themselves to him. So this is exactly the same phrase, and obviously that is in God's place of worship. So you have within the Pentateuch itself, notice it's just we're talking about Job, but it's this passage of Moses and Joshua appearing in the tent of meeting. So clearly, this to stand before does not necessitate a heavenly idea. And, some people will say, well, it says in the text, where have you, to Satan, where have you come from? And he says, from roaming the earth. But the question that I guess we can have is, why isn't standing before the Lord, worshiping in his place of worship, going from the mundane places on everyday life to present oneself before the Lord? Why couldn't this be God's people? That is Job. Job presents himself to the place of worship, and Satan's there accusing and saying, hey, Job is just like everyone else. And so we see that clearly you can see it's exactly the same idiom, Hithpael of Yatsab plus all, Hithpael of Yatsab plus all, and clearly that's presenting themselves on earth. Now, granted, Satan says, I've come from the earth, and you might take that as favoring standing before God in heaven. And it is true. This, just to notice this as we pass by, this is the prophet taking his stand upon his watchtower to wait for God to answer. You do have kind of a heavenly thing in Zechariah 6:5, from standing upon the Lord. This is a little confusing to me exactly how the grammar works. You have the four winds of heaven, feminine participle, going out from the one standing upon the Lord, and that's singular. I don't know. I guess you can have one being feminine and one being masculine, but I want to do a little more work on that. But you can see it's similar to Hithpael, standing upon. So I guess you could say that may could go either way. But most people come to Job 38 and say this is the one that settles it, because it says the morning stars sang together, and then the parallelism, and all the B'nai Elohim shouted for joy. And so most people, and the Septuagint does this, says, well, that's obviously the angels, because Job 38 is talking about creation, and man wasn't created yet, so therefore the sons of God have to be angels. Well, there may be some power to that argument. I wish I had the notes here, and maybe I'll do it in a follow-up video. There are Jewish interpreters that don't interpret B'nai Elohim as angels here. But it's interesting. The assumption is the stars of the morning are somehow parallel to the angels. But the question that I have with that is, I thought in Genesis, need to probably switch this from typing in Hebrew. It's like, that's a great way to do some work, but it will completely mess things up. if you go to Genesis 15, I thought the stars of heaven were associated with something else. Look to the heaven, number the stars, and what are the stars associated with? So shall your seed be. The trillions and trillions of stars, by God's statement, is associated with the offspring of Abraham. The offspring of Abraham, not angels. It's an assumption. And you say, well, it's before creation, so it has to be angels. Well, it's funny. Go back and read Proverbs 8:22. I think it's all the way through 35, and it talks about Lady Wisdom, or God's wisdom, being with God at creation. And if you read that passage, it's very odd, in that it talks about wisdom. Well, here I can pull it up, I guess. 8:22, Proverbs 8:22. It's very interesting, that text. The Lord, this is Lady Wisdom, the Lord possessed me as the beginning of his works. Ages ago I was set up. There's an odd connection between this verse and Psalm 2. That's with this word. That's kind of how I came across this passage. I was set up at first before the beginning of the earth, when there was no depths, before the mountains, before the hills, before he'd made the earth. He established it. He drew a circle around the heap. He assigned the seas. I was beside him like a master workman. And of course, all this is going back to Genesis 1 and perhaps introducing the Memra there in God's creation. Some of the Targums do that. I was his daily delight. And then look at this, rejoicing in the inhabited world, making laugh in the world. And recall, all of these things are before things are happening. His delighting, or my delighting with the B'nai Adam. In other words, that somehow in God's economy, that things are happening before they actually break into reality. And so this idea that, the stars, which elsewhere are associated with the offspring of Abraham, that somehow these are clearly angels, I'm less convinced of. I mean, maybe, but in Scripture you want to build interpretations from what's clear, less clear, to the more clear. That's called the analogy of faith. And so to go to a text in Job that may or may not associate the phrase with angels, I find less convincing. I wonder if even Job 38:7 is using the phrase of God's redeemed people, and that before actual creation ever happened, that somehow in God's experience of eternity, that those redeemed people are praising God. I don't know. It's interesting. be interested in your comments. Uh, Thanks, and I'll talk to you next time.